The average classical Greek writer has less than 15 copies of his works still in existence. You stack them up, they're about 4 feet high. So how would that compare to the New Testament? I thought about this, about how can I express this visually? So I thought, well, the average classical work, it's kind of like this podium, about 4 feet high. This is actually a photograph of this very podium. And then the New Testament, what could I use to illustrate that? Well, how about the Empire State Building? And I have to add, in New York City, to those of you who are, I guess, USD students, is that right? Because you don't know where it is, but anyway. But that's not to scale. Now I'm going to show you this to scale. Here's the podium. Okay, now you can see it. See that dot? It's about a pixel. It's 4 feet tall. And here's the Empire State Building, 1,454 feet tall. But it's not just one Empire State Building. So you have the average classical author. He's got manuscripts that stack up to one podium. The New Testament, we're just talking about the Greek and other versions, just like we are for the classical authors. And we're not talking about the Church Fathers quotations. I have no idea how to quantify that. It's not just one Empire State Building. It's 4.5. That's 6,600 feet tall, 1.25 miles high, versus 4 feet high. So you can understand why scholars speak about having an embarrassment of riches when it comes to the New Testament. And you can understand why we have far more textual variants for the New Testament than any classical authors have of their works, because we have a whole lot more manuscripts than they do. I was going to talk to you a little bit about Greco-Roman historians and biographies. I'll just touch on this briefly. You could go through and see a number of historians and biographers, which is very similar to the genre we have for the New Testament. And we've got Pliny the Elder right around the time of the first, when the New Testament was written, Plutarch's Lives, Josephus, the historian for Judaism at the end of the first century, Polybius, Pausanias, who wrote a geography of Greece, and we have either no manuscripts or just small shreds of manuscripts for 700 years for Pliny, 800 years Plutarch, 800 for Josephus, etc. These are well-known historians and biographers. They are not just the average classical authors. Then there's Herodotus and his histories. We do have some fragments, but not much, for 1,500 years. Xenophon's Hellenica. We're waiting 1,800 years before we get anything more than a few scraps of papyrus. If the New Testament were in that kind of shape, it would be like saying the first substantial copy of the New Testament, of any portion of the New Testament, more than just a few pages, was written at about the same time that the Wright brothers invented the airplane. That's when skeptics would have a claim that we can't possibly get back to the New Testament. And even then, I'm not so sure that claim would be that impressive, because scholars who work with these other ancient texts, they say, this is the best we've got, and we're pretty darn sure that it comes close to what that author originally said. So when you think about the New Testament, we've talked about the number of manuscripts, but how far back do they go? Well, let me talk to you about the discovery of P-52, which for those of you who are older folks, you know about the P-51 Mustang in World War II. This is not an airplane. This is Papyrus 52. And it's a manuscript that was discovered in 1934. But let me go back 90 years prior to that. In 1844, there was a scholar at Tübingen University in Germany named Ferdinand Christian Bauer. And Bauer, using Hegelian dialectic, basically thesis, antithesis, synthesis. You've all heard that, right? You're familiar with that. Like when a father tells his daughter, you will not have a tattoo on your body. And she says, yes, I will. Thesis, antithesis, and then the synthesis is she gets a tattoo. But well, it doesn't quite work out that way for Bauer, but he studied under Professor Hegel. This is in the 1700s, 1800s when he was there. And he decided that on basis of this philosophical construct, the New Testament was dated very, very late. And the Gospel of John in particular was extremely late. He dated the Gospel of John to about 160 or later, AD 160. Well, that's a long time after John would have lived. And consequently, Bauer argued that there's nothing of any historical reliability in John's gospel. That view, or a view close to that, held sway for nearly 100 years in European scholarship, until a man named Colin H. Roberts, freshly minted out of his doctoral program, was going through some scraps of papyri left by his predecessor at the Manchester University's John Rylands Library, and he came across this scrap of papyrus. The actual size is about the size of a credit card. And on one side, he noticed it was John chapter 18, verses 31 through 33. On the back side, John 18, verses 37 and 38. What that told him was that this manuscript was originally written on a codex. A codex is like our modern book form, where it's bound on one side, and then you have the three cut pages, and you can flip it. You know, some of you have seen a book. Most of you probably have not, because you use computers, and that goes back to the older technology of scrolling. But we know that the codex, Christians didn't invent it, but they were the first to popularize it. We know it was invented in the second half of the first century AD, and in the first 500 years of the Common Era, over 90% of all Christian books were written on a codex, while only 14% or so of non-Christian books were written on a codex. It was the first, and I think only time, in the history of the church where Christians were ahead of the technological curve. So, here's a manuscript that C.H. Roberts looked at, and he was able to date it. He said it's dated somewhere between AD 100 and 150. He sent photographs to the three leading papyrus scholars, known as a papyrologist, in Europe, and each one of them independently wrote back to him and said, this should be dated as early as AD 100, as late as AD 150. Here was a manuscript, a small fragment of a manuscript, that told us that the whole Gospel of John was originally what this was of, and it sent 2 tons of German scholarship to the flames. An ounce of evidence is what C.H. Roberts discovered, and that was worth a pound of presumption, or 2 tons of presumption in this case. That's, I think, what we're dealing with when we're looking at New Testament manuscripts. What is the evidence? It may not be a lot of evidence, and yet I'd say 5,500 manuscripts in Greek is a lot of evidence. So we also have some other manuscripts that come early, as many as a dozen from the 2nd century, and then we go all the way through the 10th century, AD 1,900 years after the New Testament is completed. We have at least 967 Greek New Testament manuscripts written in the first millennium. Now, what if you were to compare that with the average classical author? Within 900 years of the New Testament's completion, almost 1,000 manuscripts, as we just saw. Within 900 years of the average classical author's writings, there are 0 manuscripts. You saw that for some of these better-known authors. 1,200 years, 1,500 years, we're waiting a long time before we see any copies. So when someone says, well, gee, we don't have copies of the New Testament until maybe we have to wait for copies of copies of copies. Well, let's multiply that several dozen times, maybe 100 times, when you're talking about other ancient literature. Compared to anything else in the ancient world, the New Testament, on average, is about 1,000 times more evidential. That is, we have about 1,000 times more material evidence for the New Testament than we do the average classical author. And it comes as much as 1,000 years earlier than the average classical author. That's an embarrassment of riches. And it is an embarrassment because we simply don't have enough scholars to work on this.